Oh my goodness, hello guys. Today we're going to be reacting to a video called The Fallen of World War II. This video was requested by the Declarer of Memes, as you can see right here. Interesting name. Declarer of Memes. Now, without further ado, let's watch this video. And yes, I'm recording outside.
The average lifespan of an American is 80 years, and an 80-year-old today was 10 when World War II ended, 4 when it began. A soldier who saw battle would have to be in his late 80s at least today. Generals, political leaders, the decision makers of the war, few are still with us. And over the past few decades, we've seen authors and film.
It's cool, you get to see how old all the leaders, how the world's leaders got before they died. I don't know, just cool to look at. Anyway, let's just continue.
Filmmakers rush to capture stories from survivors before this connection of memory is lost. This project is not about individual war stories, and it's not about survivors.
I also, shout out to this channel, Neil Halloran. I've seen that they also have this on a website as well. I'm pretty sure it's also called The Fallen of World War II. You'll find it. And it's pretty cool. On the website, it's interactive, which is fun.
We're going to tally up the tens of millions of people whose lives were cut short by the war, and see how these numbers stack up to other wars in history, including trends in recent conflicts.
Hey, those are people. Oh my god.
We'll be counting soldiers and civilians separately. Each of these figures represents 1,000 people who died. Civilians were of all walks of life, whereas military deaths were almost entirely men.
Jesus.
The average age was about 23.
23?
In most battles, for every 1,000 soldiers killed, there are more than 1,000 who are injured. The word casualty can be confusing because in military speak, it often includes both deaths and injuries, and anything else that takes a soldier out of service. Here, we're just counting the deaths, and we'll begin with American soldiers.
Jeez, I wish the bug would go away. Very annoying.
Over 400,000 died.
Dang, I think in the Civil War about 600,000 American died. And that was just us fighting ourselves. We didn't enter World War II until 1941. We didn't really start fighting until 1942. And the, Operation Torch, Midway, all that stuff. Also, I think it's important to whenever we see all these blown up projections of how many people died, we often forget these people's individual stories. Each of these people who have died had their own story, and those stories were just ended early because of this war that happened. Just weird to think about.
Most of the deaths occurred in the European theater, fighting the Nazis.
Really?
And about a quarter were in the Pacific, fighting the Japanese.
I thought they would have had most
When you put them on the
casualties for the
timeline,
Japanese.
you see that casualties were the heaviest at the end of the war.
That
The war
makes
began on
sense.
September 1st, 1939. But the U.S. wasn't willing to join the fight until Pearl Harbor, 2 years in. The deaths increased drastically on D-Day, when the Allies invaded Normandy. One of the most tragic moments of the war was on D-Day at Omaha Beach, where 2,500 Americans died. So about the same number of US soldiers died on this single beach landing as the entire 13 years of the recent war in Afghanistan.
Jeez. 13 years of war compared to just one day in World War II. I'm speechless. That's crazy to think about.
The bloodiest battle in the Pacific was Okinawa, which lasted 82 days, during which 12,500...
82 days? That's crazy. I usually see battles that are like one day, 1 or 2 days, maybe even 3, but 82 days, that's crazy.
Americans died. About 5,000 of these deaths were at sea from kamikaze attacks.
Jeez.
Now let's look at some other countries, starting with Europe. Germany started World War II when it invaded Poland. Poland ultimately lost 200,000 soldiers in the war.
Could you go away, please?
Most died after the invasion while the country was occupied by Germany.
Oh yeah, that was a bunch of guerrilla warfare.
Germany, meanwhile, lost just 16,000 in the invasion of Poland. The Nazis went on to invade and conquer other countries, including Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands, France, Greece, and Yugoslavia.
How did Yugoslavia lose so many?
But after losing 92,000 soldiers in the Battle of France, over 200,000 ultimately fell, which includes deaths in POW camps, French colonies, and other fighting. Yugoslavia suffered almost half of...
I guess most of these countries are losing so much because of guerrilla warfare after being taken over.
1 million military deaths. The initial invasion brought relatively few casualties from both sides, but the deaths mounted under Nazi occupation due to guerrilla fighting, civil conflict, and mass executions. The Nazi invasions were swift, with relatively few German losses. Even the Nazi commanders expressed surprise at their success. And then we have the United Kingdom and the United States, who were not invaded, but took the fight to the Nazis. Britain lost about the same number of soldiers as the US, which includes the British colonies. Germany lost about 500,000 soldiers fighting the US and Britain in what is known as the Western Front, which took place in France and Belgium.
Stop. I should not have recorded outside. This is a bad idea.
But most Nazi soldiers died in the Eastern Front.
Oh, yeah.
Germany's unsuccessful invasion of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, even though the war in the East lasted only 4 years. I say only, but 4 years is still a very long time. But it lasted 4 years, yet the casualties combined, the Soviets and Germans are like over 10 million. It's crazy.
The numbers are staggering.
Jeez.
The most famous battle of the Eastern Front, and perhaps the turning point of the European war, was Stalingrad. The German Sixth Army successfully took Stalingrad, but then got surrounded by the Soviets and cut off from food and ammunition. 500,000 Nazis would ultimately die in Stalingrad. Another 100,000 were taken prisoner, of which 6,000 would ever return. POWs had a low survival rate throughout World War II, and it was particularly grim in the East. When you include these POWs, roughly the same number of Germans died in Stalingrad as all the Western Front fighting against France, the UK, and the US. And those...
Jeez, one battle, the Battle of Stalingrad, was able to encompass more losses than all of the fighting, all of the battles in the Western Front.
Stalingrad was a victory for the Soviets. They suffered almost twice as many losses as Germany.
Oh my gosh. It's a lot.
The Soviet Union would eventually defeat the once unstoppable German army, killing 2.3 million Nazi soldiers. But winning the war came at a cost.
It's still going up. It's still going up. It's still going up. Wait, is it still going to be going up? Okay, I just skipped 5 seconds. It's so cool.
$8.7 million is the official tally by the Russian military. A hotly disputed number.
8.7 million.
Some studies have calculated as many as 14 million.
Oh my gosh. The Soviets lost more than
the count of European military
everybody.
Deaths. We need to add German deaths from other fronts, including the North and Africa, as well as deaths from other Axis powers allied with the Nazis: Hungary, Romania, and Italy.
Oh yeah. Romania was... Wait, what about Bulgaria? And also, Romania and Italy technically joined the Allies later in the war. I think Romania joined in 1944 and Italy joined in 1943.
When you put these European military deaths on the timeline, it looks like this. You can now interact with the chart to learn more.
Yeah, like I said, you can do that on the website.
If you'd like more time.
Yeah, this website's pretty cool.
And now we switch to civilian deaths in Europe.
Oh gosh.
Six million Jewish people were killed in the Holocaust.
Oh yeah, that's like 6 million Jews as a third of all the Jews in the entire world at the time. It's crazy.
If you separate this by country, you see that about half, 2.7 million, were Polish. 700,000 were Soviets,
country,
followed by Hungary and 17 other countries.
There's so many from just one country.
Broken down another way, about half of the 6 million were killed in the concentration camps. Over 1 million died in Auschwitz. Most were killed in the gas chambers. Others died from starvation, exhaustion, disease, and other forms of execution. The second most deadly camp was Treblinka, which was exclusively an extermination camp, set up to look like a train station. Mobile killing groups killed 1.4 million Jews. Like with the gas chambers, men were killed first to reduce the risk of revolt.
God.
The Holocaust also includes non-Jewish deaths. Between 130,000 to 500,000 Roma, then called Gypsies, were killed. The numbers are disputed. About 250,000 people with disabilities were killed. Homosexuals, Catholics, and other groups were also exterminated, but their numbers are relatively small. Some historians say that other civilian deaths should go under the label of Holocaust. About 2 million non-Jewish Poles were killed under German occupation. Some of which were sent to the gas chambers at Auschwitz. When you combine civilian and military deaths, over 16% of the total Polish population died in World War II.
16% of a country just wiped out. What the heck? That's so hard to imagine. Just trying to put that into perspective. That's crazy. 16%.
Which is the highest percentage of any country. But not the highest in total death count. The Soviet Union again tops that list,
gosh.
losing at least as many civilians as it did soldiers. Somewhere between 10 and 20 million. A particularly dark moment for the Soviet Union was the siege of Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. German forces surrounded Leningrad before civilians could be evacuated. Supplies, including food, were cut off for 2.5 years. 1.5 million people died as a result, mostly from starvation, mostly civilians.
My gosh, how big was Leningrad at the time?
Stalin's cruelty towards his own people is partly responsible for these numbers. He often didn't allow civilians to evacuate from cities. thinking it would cause the soldiers protecting them to fight harder. About 1 million Soviets died in Stalin's own labor camps, called the Gulag. Just about every country suffered civilian losses, especially countries who were in peace. While many died as a result of so-called collateral damage, the biggest numbers occurred when it was no accident. Civilians were exterminated, purposely fired upon or bombed, used as human shields, or intentionally deprived of food. The intentional killing of civilians was done by most warring parties, including the United Kingdom and the United States.
Oh yeah. Did you know that the United Kingdom, they actually killed more people in their bombings of Germany than Germany did to Britain? Well, I mean, that's mostly because Britain had air superiority most of the war. But that's just like crazy how we hear about all these like London bombings. Imagine what it would be like for the German civilians at the time. It had nothing to do with the Nazi regime or anything. Nothing to do with the war. But of course, the same thing goes for all these other countries, but nothing to do with the war. And then, next thing you know, they're homeless.
The United Kingdom was spared of a land invasion, but still lost 60,000 civilians, largely from German air raids or blitzes, often directed at civilian population centers. The UK did the same to German cities at a much greater magnitude, causing about 10 times the number of deaths.
Oh, shoot. 10 times? I knew it was more, but I didn't know it was that more. Oh my god.
But most German civilian deaths came from the ground at the late stage of the war. When the Nazi regime collapsed, civilians living in occupied regions had to desperately flee from the advancing Soviet army.
Oh yeah, the Soviets, they were like raping, killing, and pillaging all these German cities as they were advancing. And they felt justified because the Germans did the same thing to them. And it was just big sad for everybody. Big, very big sad.
Rapes were widespread, and death estimates ranged from 600,000 to 3 million.
Jeez, up to 3 million.
Let's step back and see where we are with the totals. We just counted about 20 million civilian deaths in Europe.
That's just civilian deaths.
If you add this to the European military deaths we already covered, it brings us to over 40 million.
More civilians died than soldiers did. Most civilians had nothing to do with the war. Yeah, more of them died than the actual people who fought in the war. And then again, a lot of soldiers didn't even want to fight. Because of, conscription laws. By the end of the war, they started to get more harsh. That's just crazy to me.
Then we have the Asian data. Here we see the vast majority of military deaths in Asia came from China and Japan.
Oh yeah, Japan was not very good to China at all in the war. They are similar to how the Soviets and Germans acted to their occupied countries. Like, they would rape and slaughter and all this other stuff.
On the civilian side, about 6 million deaths from China, Indonesia, Korea, Indochina, and the Philippines can be attributed to Japanese war crimes, which are sometimes compared to the Nazi atrocities due to the sheer scale of the cruelty. China had the second highest death count after the Soviet Union. And like the Soviets, the Chinese government demonstrated a stunning willingness to sacrifice its own people. Chinese nationalists opened the dike at the Yellow River, hoping the flood would halt the Japanese advance. 500,000 Chinese civilians or more were killed, which is 2 or 3 times the number who died in all countries in the 2004 Asian tsunamis. But the invasion of China only cost Japan 200,000 soldiers.
Freaking mosquitoes are
Most
very
were killed
annoying.
fighting the U.S. and allies in the Pacific War. A significant portion of Japanese civilian deaths were caused by American firebombing and the 2 nuclear attacks. Contrary to official U.S. statements, these airstrikes were directed at civilian populations, not military targets. When you add all the deaths outside Europe, it brings us to a grand total of 70 million for the war. give or take, depending on who's
70 million. That's like the population of, large countries like France and Britain. More than Britain, actually. And Spain, and that's crazy. Just imagine all of France's population right now. Just everyone dying in 6 years. That would be the scale of this war. Those numbers are similar to the numbers dead of the Black Death, the worst pandemic in all of human history. I think the Black Death only killed like 5 million more. Now there's 2 mosquitoes. This is just not good.
More people died in World War II than in any other war in history.
Wow, that's
For
crazy.
comparison, here are 20 or so of the very worst wars and atrocities we have on record. Some of these are more of atrocities than wars, but we've seen how that distinction can get blurred.
Live safe.
Some of these spanned across centuries. World War II had the high.
I don't even know most of these. I mean, I know a lot of these, but a lot of these, they look like they're major wars. Millions are dying, and I don't know about them. Why? Why don't I know about them? Like, they seem like if millions died, then why don't I know about it? And why don't more people know about it? Because that's more than 3 million is a lot of people.
And it all happened in just 6 years.
Jeez.
The world population.
I'm pretty sure the American Civil War, I think, was 6 years. And about 600,000 died. Of course, that's still a ton of people. But, 100 times the amount of people died in the Second World War. No, more than 100 times the amount. That's crazy.
Grown significantly since the earliest atrocities on this list. If you want to compare them in terms of what percentage of the world died, we can adjust the chart to look like this. This rough approximation tells us there may have been more devastating wars before World War II, proportionally speaking.
I like this chair.
When we turn to post-war conflicts, it's hard to say anything that isn't controversial. But the data shows something quite extraordinary has been happening.
Stop. They're back. Are you joking?
In 1989, John Gaddis coined the phrase the long peace to identify the absence of conflict between the nuclear powers during the Cold War. 25 years later, the Cold War is over, and the term is still being used, although its meaning may have shifted. European countries have not fought each other, except for this 10-day war in 1956 when the Soviet Union invaded Hungary.
Oh, you invaded Hungary? When was that? Was there some kind of revolt or something? Because I know Hungary was in the Soviet bloc. I know they were a puppet of the Soviet Union. Oh.
When we look at European wars before World War II, it looks like this. They tend to be more frequent as you go back, though smaller in scale. And the largest 44 economies of the world, though smaller.
That's when Germany got unified. After the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. What happened? What happened? What the heck happened? Okay. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm very sorry, guys. Wow. Okay, let's go back. Jeez, this video is already like 24
smaller
minutes.
in scale.
Oh, thank goodness.
And
Went
the
back.
largest 44 economies of the world have not battled each other since World War II. Rich countries have fought poor countries, like the US versus, but rich countries have not fought other rich countries. Such a period of peace between the so-called great powers hasn't been seen since the Roman Empire.
Really?
To many, peace is too strong of a word. Wars have occurred since World War II, and they can be grouped into these 4 categories.
Yeah. Like, have you ever played Hearts of Iron 4 with the Millennium Dawn mod? There's, like, wars all the time. They're minor ones for sure. Stop! They're minor ones for sure. Just, like, a bunch.
We don't see colonial wars anymore. We've already noted that interstate wars between rich countries have not occurred at all.
Okay, stop doing that, please.
And here we see wars involving smaller economies that tapered off.
Just 3 more minutes. I'm far away from the router, that's why.
With and without farm intervention. And this is what these battle deaths looked like alongside of World War II. More people died fighting in World War II than in all the wars since. And again, we can't forget about world population, which has almost tripled since World War II. If we scale these numbers to show deaths in proportion to world population,
like 70 years,
showing the likelihood that a person on Earth dies in battle, the downward trend becomes even more pronounced. Now, this isn't to infer anything about why this trend is occurring. That's a discussion for another day. You can now interact with this chart to explore what conflicts are behind the totals. Now, bear in mind, we're just looking at battle deaths here, not civilian deaths, but those two are intertwined. Peace is a difficult thing to measure. It's a bit like counting the people who didn't die in wars that never happened. We give such importance to the word peace, but we don't tend to notice it when it occurs, or report on it. Sometimes it takes reminding ourselves of how terrible war once was to see the peace that has been growing around us. Of course, this trend may not continue, and it's not clear how looking at these charts can help us make the right decisions to ensure that it does. But the longer the long peace grows, the more significant it becomes. So if watching the news doesn't make us feel hopeful about where things are heading, watching the numbers might.
What the heck did they... I don't know why they did that. Why is it going so slowly? Those are minutes. Oh. They're minutes. They were seconds. Okay then. Well, that was a great video. Thank you, Mr. Quitter of Memes. Very, very good video. Okay, now I just have to figure out how to stop recording. Okay, let's see. Okay.